times. And and thank you to everybody that's here with us in Zoom. I think we had 28 on Zoom last week, something to that effect. So well attended. And now we're going to get into the heart of the Federalist Papers, the 5 that we're going to take a deep dive in. And my students used to really, we can't read this crap, Dr. Pete. So that's when I started saying, well, one of the things I've learned is let's read it out loud. So what we're going to do is read all of Federalist 10 out loud. I will be sometimes referring to this chart, which if you have not printed it out, it's available on the Clallam Dems website under Alex, Jim, and John, Explain the Constitution, supplemental. If you go down in the materials, you will see Federalist 10, which is a copy of this document, or there will be a Federalist 10 supplement. That's a photograph of this chart, so you can actually print that chart out and have it handy. You may have to rotate it clockwise 90 degrees, because even though I took it in landscape and it shows up in my photos album as landscape, when I converted it to a PDF, suddenly it's portrait. So to print it, you may have to turn it 90 degrees clockwise to get it to look the way it's supposed to look. So we are beginning with one of the most famous Federalist Papers of all time. 10 and 51 are the two. If you were going to be taught the Federalist Papers in high school, those are the two you would have been taught, unless you're in an AP class with Dr. Pete, and you would have looked at 4 of them: 10, 39, 51, 78. Those are the 4 that all scholars agree are the critical ones to understand. But there's a lot of good stuff, and so I added a 5th one for this series, which is Federalist 65, which is how the Senate's supposed to operate, specifically impeachment. So not that somebody we all know with the initials DJT might get impeached again, I think is highly likely. And it would only be honorific in a sense, because he'll never get convicted in the Senate. And so, but to have Alexander Hamilton explain how the impeachment process is supposed to work, and explain to us that it's political. This is not a legal process. Legal processes could follow the Senate trial, but they don't have to. And in the case of Donald Trump's second impeachment, they did not follow it. And that was thanks to Mitch McConnell. So yes. What can I say? I can't say much good about Mitch McConnell, and I won't. Good. So we start out. What is this? This is Federalist 10, the same subject continued, meaning they opened the discussion in Federalist number 9. The Union as a safeguard against domestic faction and insurrection, from the New York Packet, that's the newspaper that printed it, Friday, November 23rd, 1787, and we know that Madison is the author. To the people of the state of New York, among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. He will not fail, therefore, to set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a proper cure for it. The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have in truth been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished, which is to say, James Madison researched all the republics that had ever existed in written history and found, why did all these they all failed. All of them failed. And he's trying to say, what's the cause of this failure? And he says, and let's not forget the fact that there were many republics, nations or areas called republics that were republics in name only, like Venice, Council of Ten. Well, they called themselves a republic. They weren't a republic. And they had this guy, this elected guy, who had the ugly name of Doge. So when you hear Doge, for me, that immediately set off a warning signal. You're calling yourself Doge, right? Okay, didn't have good luck with that. And just a little aside, the Doge was usually the oldest guy, and he was the guy that was going out on the first boat, almost, strapped to the front of the boat. He was going to be the guy that got killed. If anybody's going to get killed early on, it's the Doge. So people really didn't want to be Doge. I mean, it was honorific, but it was also dangerous. And then Madison continues, said, they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics from which the adversaries to liberty derive their most specious declamations. The valuable improvements made by the American constitutions. Now, what's he referring to? He's referring to the constitutions of the 13 colonies that existed. And he said some of them, like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, really did make dramatic improvements. Others, not so much. He says, both ancient and modern cannot certainly be too much admired. Yeah, they might be good, but they are flawed. But it would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have especially obviated the danger on this side as was wished and expected. They're all literally failures in one way or another. There are still huge issues with them. Complaints are everywhere heard from our not just our lousy citizens, but our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable. Stop and think about this. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, both annual elections on everything.
Oh my God.
So what happened? Back, forth, instability. Laws that are awful, repealed, restored, repealed. It was bad news. That our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. Alexis de Tocqueville, or Alexis de Tocqueville, if you want to pronounce it correctly, talked in his Democracy in America about the omnipotence of the majority. And that's what they're touching base is. This is what he was going to see 50 years later, that the majority was technically dangerous. And how do you overcome, if you're a minority, how do you overcome the majority? However anxiously we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of known facts will not permit us to deny that they are in some degree true. It will be found indeed on a candid review of our situation that some of the distresses under which we label have been erroneously charged on the operation of our governments. But it will be found at the same time that other causes will not alone account for many of the heaviest misfortunes, and particularly for that prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements and alarm for private rights, which are echoed from one end of the continent to the other, even though they didn't have the whole continent. Remember, it stopped at the Mississippi River.
Well, with any luck, we'll be adding Canada.
Well, yeah, it was our 51st state. These must chiefly, if not wholly, effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with which a factious spirit has tainted our public administrations. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse or passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So now we switch to get a little bit more of an explanation. What's the ultimate concern here? Well, let's see what George Washington had to say. And this is about halfway through his farewell address. And he talked about geographic factions. He was worried about northern, southern, western factions. There wasn't an east at that point because the west was Ohio, Kentucky, yeah, the far west, serious, far west was Ohio, Kentucky, etc. So north, south, west. I've already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate dominion of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, in which different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition into the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty.
Wow.
That'll never happen.
Yeah. So what could be more appropriate? And Lincoln in his Lyceum speech warned of the same thing, but he was talking about Stephen Douglas, who, if you ever look at the career of Stephen Douglas, was a bombastic liar who would tell one crowd one thing, deny that he'd said it to another crowd, say something else, reverse back and forth. So Abraham Lincoln really disliked Stephen Douglas, even though Douglas, in a way, would turn out to be a hero. After knowing he was going to lose the 1860 election, he went and campaigned in the Deep South anyway, promoting union. That was a brave thing for him to do. But in many ways, he was like the Trump of the 1850s, took advantage wherever he could get it, lied out all sides of his mouth at the same time. So Lincoln got it. He says, so here we have factions, political parties, groups. Madison says there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its causes. So we go up here and saying our two methods to cure. One is remove the causes, and the other is to control the effects. There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one, so we go over here, what can you do to remove the causes? One, by destroying the liberty which is essential to his existence. So here we have founded a nation based upon liberty, and to get rid of factions, we got to destroy that liberty. He says, which is essential. He says, the other by giving every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. Okay. So he says, now, let's take a look at each of these options and to see whether they are workable. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy, it was worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an aliment without which it instantly expires. But could it be not less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency? So he says, okay, this is a non-starter. We can't get rid of liberty. So what can we do? Well, there's another thing. Give every citizen same opinions, same passions, same interests. Can somebody think of a word of everybody being given the same passions, the same interests, the same,
Occult?
huh?
Occult?
Not a cult,
Brainwashing?
brainwashing, indoctrination. Yeah, that's the idea. He says, okay, so we could brainwash. Everybody has to think alike the same way. It's kind of like the old Soviet Union. Says the latent, so he says, the second expedient is as impracticable, here's that word that I don't like, as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues to be fallible. So he's saying, okay, we understand human beings. Their reason is fallible. It's always going to be fallible. He is at liberty to exercise it. Different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other. And the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. So I love my opinions. I'm now sure 100% I'm right. And if you don't hold the same opinion I have, you are wrong. The diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate is not less an insuperable obstacle to the uniformity of interests. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. So the ability to have different opinions is the protection of these opinions, these differing opinions, he said, is the first object of government. We want people to think for themselves. We want them to arrive at their own opinions. We need to protect that. Fire away.
But it's confusing, his use of the word faculties, because he goes on to indicate that he's talking about property.
Well, that's a separate issue. There are differences in the ability of people to have or not have property, but or to be, let's suppose you are a brilliant economist and you understand the economy like nobody else does. So you have an advantage in having that insight that nobody else would have. But that ends up, so you have different abilities, a spectrum of ability to think, a spectrum of your personal wishes, a spectrum, but then there's also a spectrum of what you actually own that goes along, sometimes parallels that. That's the idea that, so he is talking not just about one thing, but all those things together. So he says, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well as speculation as of practice, an attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for the common good. So no matter what you have or own or how well you can think, if you are not putting the common good at the highest level, that's virtue. That's what Washington calls virtue. Then it's going to dissolve into factions and fractious behavior. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion, so even if it's just a tiny little thing, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions, and now we hit into the part that you were referring to, have been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinctive interest in society. Those who are creditors and who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation. So maybe he's hinting, maybe you can fix some of this with legislation, and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. Then he starts to dissect this a little bit. No man is allowed to be a judge of his own cause because his interest would certainly bias his judgment and, not improbably, corrupt his integrity. With equal, nay, greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. Yet what are many of the most important acts of legislation? But so many judicial determinations, not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens? And what are the different classes of legislators but advocates and parties to the causes which they determine? Is a law proposed concerning private debts? It is a question to which the creditors are parties on one side and the debtors on the other. Justice ought to hold the balance between them. Yet the parties are and must be themselves the judges, and the most numerous party, or in other words, the most powerful faction, must be expected to prevail. Shall domestic manufacturers be encouraged, and in what degree by restrictions on foreign manufacturers? That would become a major point of confrontation in the very first Congress, as Alexander Hamilton tries to implement his manufacturing plan. So you see, Madison recognizes this, looking ahead and saying, well, what kind of nation are we going to be? How do we break ourselves away truly from dependence on Britain? That's the key. The apportionment of taxes on the various descriptions of property is an act which seems to require the most exact impartiality. Yet there is, perhaps, no legislative act in which greater opportunity and temptation are given to a predominant party to trample on the rules of justice. Every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number is a shilling saved for their own pockets. So there's something in each side. It is vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm.
Oh,
This is a critical attempt. He said, we need them, but he says, I'm telling you folks, we're not always going to have enlightened statesmen. Nor, in many cases, can such an adjustment be made at all without taking into view indirect and remote considerations, which will rarely prevail over the immediate interest which one party may find in disregarding the rights of the other or the good of the whole. That's the good of the whole is always the idea. The inference to which we are brought is the causes of faction cannot be removed, and relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. So, destroying liberty, non-starter. Everybody thinking the same way, non-starter. So we can't get rid of, so the bottom line is we can't get rid of the causes of faction. So what's our alternative then? Well, we have to control the effects. Well, how exactly are we going to do that? If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle. Now, Republican principle, remember, we're talking about a political system where you elect representatives. That's what a republic means. And hopefully, wise voters elect a capable, educated, thoughtful representative. And many times that's happened, but many times it hasn't happened. So, which enables the majority, so the faction consists of less than the majority relief is applied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. It may clog the administration. It may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. When a majority is included in the faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of the citizen. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time preserve the spirit and form of a popular government, this is the great object to which our inquiries are directed. Let me add that it is the great desideratum by which this form of government can be rescued from the opprobrium under which it has so long labored, and be recommended to the esteem and adoption of mankind. So, if a faction is a minority, no problema. But if the faction is a majority, to secure the good as the great object, the majority must be rendered unable to carry into effect its schemes of oppression.
So our dysfunctional or do-nothing Congress is by design.
Technically, yes. The Senate was to be more of the debating society. The House, because it represented the people with the initial Constitution, we need to put to establish the idea that the House was the one branch that was directly related to the people. And that was the one that Madison would think was the most dangerous and the most in need of control. The Senate, the other half, was not directly elected by the people at the time the Constitution was ratified. Instead, there was another layer in between. The layer in between was another layer of representatives called your state legislature. So initially, the people elect their state legislators. The state legislators then elected the state senator. So you had two layers where hopefully some thought would go into the process, and that you would have intelligent representatives electing an even more intelligent senator. So representatives electing representatives. The problem with that was it quickly boiled down to whichever party controlled the House of Representatives, the legislature in the states, also elected the senator. So the majority, you didn't very often get minority candidates. Very seldom did you get a minority candidate. So in effect, it was distancing the same it was only distancing the same popular election and ending up with exactly the same problems. So from this view of the subject, so we have controlling the effects, and we've gone through here. So we must render the majority unable. And how do we do that? Well, we've got, again, two choices. Because we talked about the limitations of a republic, but there's also a pure democracy. And he says, what Madison says, from this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. Because the common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Just think of Socrates, that he was rowing upstream, creating a problem in a pure democracy, and they convicted him and essentially forced him to take poison. So that's a pure democracy in its worst form. You can't broker any dissent. So hence, it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with the personal security or the rights of property. and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. This reminds you a lot of Karl Marx. This is pretty much exactly what Karl Marx was proposing. And yet it never, the idea is a good idea. The actual government created from it failed every single time, except it's hard to look at China as a failure. From a human rights standpoint, from a democratic standpoint, it is an obvious failure. But from a capitalistic standpoint, it's become quite a nation to contend with in a lot of ways.
But capitalism and democracy are not
Not necessarily interchangeable. That is absolutely correct. Then he says, okay, let's go on. He says, a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let us examine the points in which it varies from a pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature of the cure and the efficacy which it must derive from the union. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens in the greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. So then he says, okay, the effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves convened for that purpose. On the other hand, the effect may be inverted. Men of factious tempers, of local prejudices, or of sinister designs may by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means first obtain the suffrages and then betray the interests of the people. The question resulting is whether small or extensive republics are more favorable to the election of proper guardians of the public weal, and it is clearly decided in favor of the latter by two obvious considerations. So we have moved the chart. Pure democracy is no solution. A republic seems to be the possible solution, but then you have large republics and you have small republics. So he says, now let's take a look at the disadvantages of the one over the other. He says, in the first place, it is to be remarked that however small the republic may be, representatives must be raised to so you have to have a certain number of representatives in order to guard against the cabals of a few. And that, however large it may be, they must be limited. So you need a certain number, but it can't be too large a number of representatives in order to guard against the confusion of a multitude. So it's got to be a large enough republic to have an appropriate representation of all the interests, but it can't be so large or you just end up in mass confusion. Think of the Russian Duma. I think the Russian Duma has something like 3,000 members. I'm not too far off. I think it's about 3,000. And it is a mess. Nothing in Russia gets done by the Duma.
It's the Goldilocks principle.
Yeah. So, in the next place, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, it would be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried. And the suffrages of the people being more free will be more likely to center in men keep in mind who they're writing, no women involved, you know.
Why wouldn't it?
Yeah, women were in a terrible situation, and that is not going to unravel itself until 1920 with the 19th Amendment, and it hasn't unraveled itself yet. Women still, for example, do not make the same money for the same job. I think it's up, it's like 75, maybe 78% now, but women still make less for the same job than men do. So it's so hard to break through those issues that we have long had. Is just think DEI, for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Republicans are claiming, well, that means, no, you don't understand. That's to get the best person for the job and not exclude them by their race, by their sex, by whether they're transgender, and ad nauseum down the line. It was to get the best person for the job, not protect white people. So it says it will be more difficult it says, and the suffrages of the people being more free will likely center men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. So you're going to have good people more good people will be available to vote for in a large republic than in a small republic. It must be confessed that in this, as in most other cases, there is a mean on both sides which inconveniences will be found to lie. By enlarging too much the number of electors, you render the representatives too little acquainted with their local circumstances and lesser interests. And we see that today. That it's very difficult for Emily Randall to represent all the interests of that very diverse population that she's representing. She does a pretty good job, though. By reducing it too much, you render him, unduly attached to these and too little fit to comprehend and pursue great and national objects. And we see throughout United States history, we see those representatives who are locked into these provincial ideas and never can see what the nation needs as opposed to what their local, let's dig for more coal because coal is clean, it's wonderful, and we get millions of more jobs. The federal Constitution forms a happy combination in this respect, the great and aggregate interests being referred to the national and the local and particular to the state legislatures. So it's saying, hey, not only do we have this large republic, but we also have smaller republics, our state republics. And then in essence, you even have a local republic for all practical purposes. So you're going to have different layers here. The other point of divergence is the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than Democratic government. So up to this point, it was that you could only have small republics. It hadn't been tested in an expansive republic. And Madison is saying that this is a large republic is going to be its saving grace. See,
Is that true?
at the time, well, the history doesn't help us too much on that because you would think you can't get a minority faction that could upend the government, but that's exactly what the Confederate States were, is a minority faction that ends up upending the government and threatening the Union. So we're pointing out that Madison didn't call everything correctly. For 1787, this idea that suddenly we have this great expanse of land, communication's going to be slow. How can you develop a majority faction among all these crazily different, your Puritans from the North who distrust the slaveholders from the South. And then you got these Western hillbillies. And then you got these Scotch Irish coming down in the middle of that are very different from the coastal elites. So they're figuring, hey, with all these differences, this is a win-win, that they will cancel each other out, which ultimately doesn't happen. The other point of the grid says, okay, and it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party, and the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily they will concert and execute their plans of oppression. So we'll get to the War of 1812, and we think of the Civil War where the Southern states, the warning that George Washington has. But in the War of 1812, it's the New England states that proposed to secede from the Union, threatened to secede from the Union in the Hartford Convention, because they didn't like the way the economy was going and things were shaping up in this war. They thought the war was initially was a great idea, then they realized, no, it's a bad idea. This is a very bad idea. Extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive. Notice less probable. It didn't say impossible here. That the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and act in unison with each other. Besides other impediments, it may be remarked that where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in the proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over small republic, is enjoyed by the union over the states composing it. Does the advantage consist in the substitution of representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to local prejudices and schemes of injustice? It will not be denied that the representation of the Union will be most likely to possess these requisite endowments, and it often did. Does it consist in the greater security offered by a greater variety of parties against the event of any one party being able to outnumber and oppress the rest? In an equal degree, does the increased variety of parties comprised within the Union increase this security? Does it, in fine, consist in the greater obstacles opposed to the concert and accomplishment of the secret wishes of an unjust and interested majority? Here again, the extent of the Union gives it the most palpable advantage. And again, keep in mind that these states, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, you have the southern states that had much in common. But even slavery in the southern states was different between Maryland and Virginia and North and South Carolina and Georgia. It was much more severe in the deep South states and would continue that trend throughout. Virginia would end up being using slavery to supply slaves, so that there becomes an economic incentive in Virginia to, hey, we have a surplus of slaves. They need them, so they make a profit in doing that. But then you have the Puritans in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont. Now, for New Hampshire and Vermont, one of them, New Hampshire was not yet a state at that time, but entirely different societies, much stricter in some ways. So the Puritans of the North were different than the Cavaliers. So you had the winners of the English Civil War settle in the North, and the losers of the English Civil War settle in the South. So in a lot of ways, the American Revolution was not just a revolution against England, it was our first Civil War. And a lot of people don't, with very different viewpoints and very different to get them to go along with each other. Hence why they like the Articles of Confederation, where each state, no matter what its population, had one vote. Small states liked that. Large states said, this is bullshit. Yes,
I don't know if you read this book or recommended it. It's called American Nations,
by,
Colin Woodard. And it's the 11 cultures of the country.
that makes perfect sense to me.
It brings all of these different
Okay,
actions
right.
of all, we were not all.
It wasn't a
cohesive.
uniform culture,
No.
right? So the question was I aware, what's the name of the book?
American Nation.
American Nation, which dealt with 11 different cultures?
Our 11 cultures.
Or 11 cultures, which makes and that's the difficulty in trying to form a union out of all these different cultures. And they really distrusted each other,
Right.
seriously distrusted each other.
It's an
And
excellent book.
that's where, and so I will look that, I agree, that sounds like a great book to read and help us to understand.
American Nations by Colin Woodard.
American Nations by Colin Woodard. Thank you. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states. There we go to our 13 states with 11 different cultures, but will be unable to spread as a general conflagration through the other states. Ultimately, he was wrong about that, where slavery was a conflagration. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, which also happened. So we had the Church of England, which obviously after the Revolutionary War couldn't be called the Church of England. Where are you going to church, George? I'm going to the Church of England. Oh, really? Didn't we? So that became the Episcopal Church. You did have some, and of course you didn't want the leader of the Episcopal Church to be the Archbishop of England. Can't have that. So, and then you had, there were Baptists, serious number of Baptists, small numbers of Lutherans. Methodism was big. Baptists were probably like the second largest throughout the United States at that part.
Really?
And then you had different, of course, you had your old school, and then you had your new school, and then you had, let's see, I'm trying to think, Presbyterian. You had an old school there and a new school there. They fractured all over the place. And you had some small number of Jewish congregations. And George Washington made it a point to visit the one in Providence, Rhode Island. And he also made it a point to visit Catholic churches, because the Protestants generally looked on Catholics with huge prejudice and disfavor. So only one colony was founded, Maryland was founded by Catholics.
Georgia.
Georgia was that was like a prison state almost at its beginning. I'm trying to think. I think that ended up being
It
more
was the
Baptist.
Australia of America.
It technically was the Australia of America. That's where. Yeah, so you look at how some of these states were formed, and of course, Maryland had the act. They passed the Act of Religious Toleration, very important. And what it actually did was exactly opposite what it said it did. What it said it did was, these were Catholics. We are going to allow you Protestants to have full rights and full citizenship in this state. What the actual outcome was, it protected the Catholics from the Protestants. That's what it was, and that's what it did accomplish. So all these crazy things here. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less likely to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. In the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than the entire state. So here we're saying, in the state, you've got protection. In the nation, you've got protection by the large size and the diverse interests. In the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government. And according to the degree of pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans, ought to be our zeal in cherishing the spirit and supporting the character of Federalists, hence the remedy. So we've gone through all these different decision-making process, and we end up with the best solution, imperfect, but the best solution is a large republic that's composed of smaller republics, and even those smaller republics are composed of local republics. And hopefully bad things will get diluted in that process. And because stop and think how slow communication was in the 1700s and 1800s until the invention of the telegraph. And even with the invention of the telegraph, where you could instantly connect faraway places, still that didn't affect those individual cultures that lived there. That was the news. And so it did become possible for a large faction, which I call the Confederate States of America, to form, which then competed with the Union for supremacy, and lost the war, lost the actual war, but I'm not sure that the South lost the war of words after the Civil War. Yes, Ted.
This was written for a particular group of people. How did this affect, or how did they enable those who can't think more than 10 minutes ahead, and still operate on what we would call today a fourth grade reading ability? How did we affect those people?
I think those because what you had in each state, a ratification convention. So you had another layer of,
Could you paraphrase the question?
Yeah,
give me the question again. I'm ADHD, so I'll have.
Started by saying this was written for a particular type of person.
How did you convince the less educated?
The less educated, those who normally can't think more than 10 minutes ahead.
And who wouldn't understand a word of this?
Yeah.
I'm reading this, I'm saying, I know people who, my God, what the hell is this?
Right. So the question that, as Ted put it up, and hopefully it came through on the microphone, okay, is how to convince uneducated people to do what's in their best interests, and especially in the southern states. This was true. South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. The South Carolina threatened to walk out during the convention several times, depending on how slavery was dealt with. It's by having those conventions, and those people, those lesser educated people, if they could vote, we have to put that little proviso in there. Maybe because you had to be, in most states, a person of property to be able to vote. And it sometimes didn't take much property, but you had to have property. They trusted the representatives that they voted for and they elected. Whether or not they understood what those representatives were actually doing or not. And let me tie in a speech that Edmund Burke made in the British House of Commons to the citizens of Bristol that he represented. And so he told them, would you have me represent exactly what your interests are, and only those interests, if I know from my experience that this other solution is better in the long run? Do you want me to be a trustee, or do you want me to be a representative? And Edmund Burke says, I'm going to be a trustee. You need to trust that my experience is such that I am voting in your best interest. And I think a little of that is true of those states that had lesser educated people.
yeah, and I think it's important to remember not everybody could read. And you know, this is a brilliant piece of writing. And this is so wonderful to read, because it shows how educated that group of people were who really set up the Constitution and set up the government, because they were referring back to European and philosophy and history. And, you know, how many people in the colonies really, read this and understood it is problematic, I
Yeah.
think. But it was for the people who were gonna vote, who were gonna lead and organize, that this went into the newspapers, and not everybody bought newspapers. And
And if they did, and often they got them second and third hand.
yeah,
And sometimes a newspaper would go to 100 different people who were not subscribers.
yeah.
Betsy,
And who were distilling this and representing these ideas to the community? Was it the pastors and the political
in
leaders?
some, yeah, who was distilling this information to the people? Certainly from the pulpit. And you tended to have educated people there. Also from your local elected officials, many of who they'd already elected, because these were operating state governments since 1776, and they trusted those people. Yes, Paul.
Two things, in the chat here, it was mentioned that Ken Burns, in the American Revolution, also talked about there was, factions as far as the Tories and supporters of the king.
Yeah.
And not, and how they wanted to deal with England. and so
Three
forth.
big factions, actually.
Okay,
The overall big factions were you were a revolutionary, a patriot, or you were a loyalist. That's 2/3. And then there was 1/3 that stuck their finger to the wind and said, we'll go whoever wins, that's the side we're on.
and then,
And John Adams, by the way, was the source of that calculation.
and relative to the question about these things, we need to remember that they weren't having a vote of the general populace.
No.
They were having a vote of their legislature essentially, or some group like that. So the people would have been educated. They put it in the papers, but the people who needed to read it were the actual 200
Yeah.
people that were
The
casting votes.
delegates to whatever state convention ratification
Right.
convention you were going to.
Right,
And as I pointed out in the last meeting, some were easy and some were hard. Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York were hard. Massachusetts shouldn't have been, but they said no Bill of Rights. The gains of the revolution are at risk.
And I think it's important to think too, that they were not, philosophically, they were sort of in favor of everyone voting. But not really, because remember, during the Confederation, they had absolute chaos.
Right.
From everybody doing whatever they wanted. And so these were property owners and the wealthy, and, they wanted to calm things down. And, ultimately, everyone voted, but that was not the case.
And in some of the northern states, free blacks could vote, which made Dred Scott decision by Roger B. Taney all that much more of a lie, in saying blacks have never been citizens and are never going to be citizens. And too many people were alive at the time that remembered. Yes. First name, by the way?
Catherine.
Catherine.
So, I'm kind of a believer in kind of human psychology being what it is. And I suspect then, as now, a vast majority of the population didn't vote and didn't care to, because they really weren't interested except for what's happening in their own little family or circle or community, and did not maybe have interest or
Mhm.
grasp what this overall governing thing was going to be. So,
Although, to counter that just a little bit, and in a different era, in the election of 1860, 80% of registered voters, mostly men, voted.
but in the context of the total.
Who all could,
numbers,
yes,
That's still a small.
Yes.
Party,
yeah.
yeah.
Ted,
I have a question about a word.
okay,
The word is educated. Today we have educated, that means you've gone to school, you probably had some kind of college or university education. Back then, somebody called Franklin,
Dr. Franklin
Dr.
had no education.
he had no formal
Yeah.
education. Some guy by the name of Lincoln did not have that.
Right.
All right, today, the word, if you are an educated person, that puts you into a particular category, which may not be good for a majority of our population.
That's
I
possible.
mean, so the word education may be the wrong.
It may
word
be
to use.
pejorative
Yeah,
now.
it's the wrong word to be using.
Right,
You've got to find another one.
right. On his informational form that Lincoln filled out when he was elected congressman, under education, he had one word, defective. Oh, he was very embarrassed about them, defective. He had less than 1 year of elementary education, and in the 3 or 4 different times that he went to school amounted to less than 1 year.
Well,
Other than that, he taught himself, and he learned to love Shakespeare.
we know people who do not have that college education, may not even have finished high school, who are very versed in many things and can be very well read, very understanding, very insightful. So the
I know.
word education sometimes means I have a PhD, that means it's just piled higher and deeper.
Which is true.
Yeah.
Having experienced that myself, there's certain
cool.
truth to that.
Yeah.
I
Question.
just was wondering, how many of the states, did any of them have a republican system already? Or,
Oh, they were almost all little republics by
okay,
that point.
they weren't.
All 13 colonies were, yeah. Better functioning and worse functioning. Like I said last week, Rhode Island was kind of out there by itself. And so, they marched to the speed of the beat of a different drummer for sure. But on the other hand, my better half was talking to me about Anne Hutchinson. And here she's forced out of that. I mean, she's tried, because she was a dissenter. And we can't have dissent in the church. So she ended up being a co-founder of Rhode Island. And Pennsylvania with the Quakers marched to the beat of a different drummer. Paul.
So you said during the thing that basically the different states did not all have a system of government commensurate with the Constitution.
Oh, no.
And it was wildly different and
And it
whatnot.
could stay that way.
And the question is,
It just had to be, later it had to be a republic. That becomes
so the question is, did states subsequently, in other words, they ratified the Constitution, and then at some point in time later went back and essentially
changed their own
rebuilt
constitution.
their own constitution?
Absolutely. You will see Pennsylvania revised its constitution several times. New York revised it several times. There were constant changes.
Revised as in amended, so put
Sometimes
Band-Aid on the
completely-
top or
Completely
just,
rewrote it.
okay.
And some of it had to do with whether or not you had annual elections. They greatly feared people holding office for more than 1 year. And so this idea of a 4-year president, holy cow. 6 years in the Senate? That was unheard of. These are little kings, were some of the arguments that were made. This was but you saw ultimately they realized that annual elections led to a lot of trouble. Dysfunction. Yes.
So do we know? course,
Real
like-
quickly,
I'm
the
sorry.
people online, anybody who's talking, please use your outside voice.
Or your teacher voice.
Yeah.
Okay, Lynn.
Thank you.
I know you're a teacher.
Yeah, and I've never had a loud voice. Do we know if, I guess we don't know, but what's your thought or anybody else's thought on how influential these Federalist, now we call them papers, when they're published in a newspaper, were they persuasive to a large degree or?
I think I can say,
Please repeat the question.
oh, the question is, how persuasive were the Federalist Papers
Right.
at the time they were published? I would say, other than in the state of New York, probably not very. Because very few, maybe only 3 or 4 of the 85 were published in out-of-state newspapers.
So
Very
within
few.
New York, were they influential?
It is thought that they were decisive in the state of New York, that the reasoning was so good and so comprehensive, as you've seen, all the different ways that James Madison was looking at different types of government, trying to show the citizens of the state of New York they had nothing to fear, that this was the best, looking at all the governments that have ever existed, including this new one that they were proposing that had never existed, that it was likely to be successful because it had been in some ways worked in the past. And I think, and all they needed to convince were the delegates to the ratification convention. That was the key audience. I think those members did read it. But remember, 2 votes separated ratification from not ratifying.
So how influential are they in sort of modern times?
I think the Supreme Court justices are very aware of what this is original. We had a long talk on originalism at another group that I work with, and the Lincoln Group of District of Columbia, trying to determine what did that mean and how did these fit into that. And I think they were very persuasive and are still persuasive. You still see justices citing Alexander Hamilton or James Madison and trying to support their interpretation of the language of the Constitution. And these are the very best explanation of what the founding fathers thought in print at any time. Yes, Ted.
Where's the source of those who disagree with the Federalist Papers? Where's the source?
Oh, you mean, are you interested in the anti-federalists?
Well, yes.
By the way, the anti-federalists also wrote 85 papers. And you can buy a book called I have a copy, The Anti-Federalist Papers. And then so you can see what they're worried about. Mostly it was protecting the rights,
So
free
that's right.
speech, the press, all those things become, what becomes the things that become the Bill of Rights. And it was, I forget, North Carolina, I think, when they ratified, they added 30 or 31 suggestions.
Oh,
What needs to be in the bill, we are ratifying it, assuming that you're going to add a Bill of Rights, and here are some suggestions. What needs to be in there, most of which found their way in different forms. Yes, Betsy.
If New York passed just by 2 votes, what did the detractors do then?
Unlike Donald Trump in 2020, they accepted it.
Okay,
They said, we lost, we made a good argument. The Federalists made a better argument. And the vote was, and in fact, a lot of delegates at our ratification convention changed their mind. There must be something to that.
but then many of them did demand that Bill of Rights.
Absolutely.
And that
That,
helped satisfy.
that
rest
was
of
the
their problem.
compromise. That was the great compromise of the ratification process, was to promise the first thing that Congress would do would be to pass a Bill of Rights. And then the first thing Congress did was not to pass a Bill of Rights.
Why was that?
They did well because they were looking at manufacturers, Alexander Hamilton's organization of the Treasury. There are some critical things in getting the government to be able to financially function that kind of got in the way. And then so New York, I forget New York and New York, of course, the 2 votes said they were going to introduce a recommendation for a new constitutional convention, along with another state, North Carolina, I think. And that's when James Madison did a preemptive strike and says, oh, by the way, tomorrow we are introducing the Bill of Rights. That's how they avoided another constitutional convention, was a practical coup d'etat, so to speak. Yes,
Question about, you know, you bringing up how influential it was. And I think it is still in the courts, it is influential. But I'm struck by certain passages of this could be very effective today to the public. I mean, who knows about the Federalist Papers
Right.
except somebody who's got a good high school, you know,
Yeah,
teacher.
yeah.
I mean, it's really, it's so,
yeah, they fly under the radar screen.
it's humbling in a way to hear this and to know that this is what they thought so many years ago and that we have survived all this time, you know. So I think it's wonderful you're doing this.
But if
I
we
think
don't
the
know
whole
these reasons,
country,
yeah, if
they
we
ought to
don't
be
know
doing
these
this.
reasons, if we don't know
know?
their thinking, that's when we get in deep trouble. Ted,
So over here mentioned that a lot of people don't pay attention to all of this because their lives are so full of whatever they need to do. So this kind of thing is at least stepping out towards those people who aren't interested or don't have the time to even think about it.
right,
This is a good thing.
to
You can toot your
remember,
own horn and say these comments have been in appreciation of having this presented. I don't know if they can hear me.
use your teacher voice, Betsy, even if you didn't have one.
About as athletic. And the audience are commenting that they're very thankful for your presentation of these ideas, because when we think about the words Federalist Papers, how many people kind of draw a blank
Right,
expression? And so, you know, these ideas are so pivotal
right,
to what we all need to know, and we have an exceptional election coming up.
right.
Yes.
Everybody should read Federalist 10. So if you all at home and everyone here can share this with their friends and neighbors.
How we got where we are and why it lasted
Yeah,
250 years so
Yes.
far.
yes.
Ted,
Watch the second episode of Ken Burns about Franklin. I just rewatched that last night in preparation for today. I mean, it was amazing about what was going on outside of the Federalist Papers before they were written. It's so important, so important.
Okay, repeat that.
that, well, there was during the Articles of Confederation, there was a very contentious spirit in the United States.
Yeah.
They were unable to think, it was not thought of the United States at the time of the United States are. There was no such thing as a nation called the United States yet.
And Ken Burns talk about what he said, which show to watch.
The second part of the American Revolution.
Ken Burns.
Yeah.
There's a lot to learn from Benjamin Franklin, by the way.
Also, he's got an episode, he's got a whole series on Franklin too.
Right.
Benjamin Franklin. And I was talking about the second episode, which is 2 hours long, of the life from like 1774 until
Right.
the end of his life.
Well, you can also pick up Walter Isaacson's book,
Yes.
Benjamin Franklin, which is a fine biography. This is a very complicated guy. And his son, William Templeton Franklin, was a loyalist governor of New Jersey. And I don't think after the American Revolution, I don't think had any correspondence with his father ever again. Went to England.
Hmm.
So it broke families apart.
Oh, yeah. I have loyalists in my family. We went back and discovered on my father's side that they left New York and went to Canada.
Mhm. Yeah. And you read some of the letters that they wrote, especially like from the South, that a guy went to London and he says, I miss the trees. It just rains here all the time. It is so depressing. But that will never happen again. I cannot go back.
Mm.
You could have migrated to Port Angeles.
Well, the indigenous peoples might not have been terribly friendly at that point in time yet. But and, you know, we don't want to get into that.
Yeah, I guess not.
That's bad.
Mhm.
Well, I think we had a very good discussion here. Thanks to all of you online and here.
What's the next one?
Federalist 39.
39.
And
Yep.
what's it
Next
about?
Monday.
Federalist 39 is about whether this essentially is this new government a national government, meaning powerful, or is it a federal government, meaning the powers resides with the states?
Yeah.
And then we'll find out what James Madison concludes.
I was gonna think, do we have an answer to that?
Yeah, we do. We do. So thanks to all of you for great questions.
Thanks, Dr. P.
Thank you very much.
I would like to announce that